All right, let's start the week off right with a book review. I am talking about the World of, there we go, The World of Null-A by A.E. Van Vogt today. Hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but whatever. So, this was a fairly interesting book. It's relatively short. It has a sequel that I haven't read yet. It was recommended several weeks ago by someone in the comments. I got a 1970 paperback version, which is extended over the original version, which I believe was published in 1945. The goal of the expansion in the 1970 version was to add a little bit more background or explanation about the Null-A philosophy. There's an extra introduction that kind of explains the connection between Null-A philosophy and general semantics, which is a real thing. You can look it up on Wikipedia or whatever. And it actually tries to explain a little bit about how the philosophy works and what it means and what it does. In short, Null-A stands for non-Aristotelian, non-Newtonian, and Einsteinian. It's one of those things that sounds really, really like out there, and parts of it are. Other parts of it are, I guess, kind of already integrated into normal thought to a certain degree. This kind of reminds me of a lot of classical economists will talk about Austrian economics like, oh yeah, they certainly had some insights and we integrated all that into classical economics, and now we've moved on and they don't have much else to say, and there are still people who believe that Austrian economics has things to say. There are still people who make mistakes in Austrian economics or using the Austrian economic method. In the same way, there are still people who think that what has been pulled out of general semantics and put into normal everyday thought is not everything that general semantics has to offer. And there's also some rather woo-woo pseudoscientific people who believe there's a lot more in general semantics than there probably actually is. For instance, there's the point in the book where he talks about how in the philosophy of Null-A, no two objects are identical. But in fact, in physics, we know that there are, in fact, objects that can be identical. We have objects that are distinguishable from each other. These are usually composite objects. And then we have bosons and fermions, which, every electron is indistinguishable from every other electron. And it's not just that this is some kind of we just can't tell the difference. If you look at how the statistics of how they move and operate and how their pressure works and stuff like that, it's different if you can distinguish between the particles and if you can't distinguish between particles, and we can actually make measurements of these things. So, for instance, the no two objects identical theorem, hypothesis, statement, assertion of Null-A turns out to not be exactly true, although it is pretty true for anything larger than a few elementary particles. Some of the other interesting things about Null-A philosophy is the idea of a link between memory and identity. There's some interesting things there. At one point in the book, they say memory equals identity, which I think is a little bit of an overstatement, but there is certainly something there to kind of think about. They also talk about how meaning requires that you make allowances for the structure through which the meaning is filtered. That's also an interesting idea. It's also something that we kind of think about these days, to be perfectly honest. This is something that I think has integrated into normal thought. There's the avoidance of either-or thinking. I was going to say avoision, but is that really a word, or is it just a joke from The Simpsons? I don't actually know. But the idea to avoid either-or thinking, again, we have a lot of that integrated into our thinking these days as well. And to, quote, communicate in relation to the rules that the other side is operating by, which is, I think, not just something that is interesting to think about, but actually good advice for dealing with, conflict, honestly. Another interesting thing about this book is that it has a tagline. Let's see if I can get that in there. By John W. Campbell. Now, John W. Campbell is a big name. He was a big sci-fi guy. He Oh man, he was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, which later became Analog, and he's the writer of Who Goes There, the author of Who Goes There, which you may know is the short story that was eventually adapted into The Thing from Another World, and then John Carpenter's The Thing. So that's a pretty good one of those once in a decade classics. It's a pretty good tagline there. That said, let's get into the actual story. This story, pardon me, unlike a lot of science fiction stuff that you see these days, which is kind of like a mystery. This one's actually a lot more like a thriller. It's got our main character Gilbert Gosane, and it's important that you pronounce his name that way. He discovers that he isn't who he thinks he is. And basically, he embarks on an adventure to prevent the overthrow of Earth and Venus and their assimilation into a hostile galactic empire. There's some interesting plot elements here to talk about. For instance, Venus is portrayed as a refuge for people who have been trained and assimilated into Null-A philosophy. Earth is run by this games machine, which sends the winners to Venus. Now, at the start of this, there was very much the impression that this could be some kind of like computer dystopia thing, and I've talked about that cliche, which was already pretty heavy cliche in the 1960s. Well, this was written in 45, so it's before that, which is nice. But this computer dystopia thing, and also the possibility of like Venus being some kind of like sugar candy mountain thing, if you've read Animal Farm, right? And in fact, that's not the case. Like the thing I was expecting to happen didn't happen, which was a nice little surprise. Venus actually is a refuge for people who are Null-A trained, and the games machine actually is running Earth relatively, running a good chunk of Earth relatively well, and actually choosing people who are, educated in or educatable in Null-A philosophy. But again, let's go back to the thriller structure. There's a lot of double crosses. There's a lot of uncertain allegiances. In such a short book, there's so much happening so fast that it actually can be a little bit hard to follow. I had to go back and kind of like flip through and be like, okay, this guy was doing this, and this guy was doing this, and this guy was doing this. It's a dense book despite being so short. There's a lot of, I think the moments that I think I found the most interesting were these points where there was kind of this like tense questioning back and forth, usually between Gilbert Gosane and some other character, either relatively friendly towards Gilbert or openly hostile towards Gilbert. There was quite a few moments of that, and that was where a lot of the really interesting, like, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What the hell is going on? This is where a lot of, and then what would happen would be that they would both ask each other questions, and so it was kind of like a little bit of a battle of wits too, to see who can get more information out of the other person, and then apply that information later on. I'd say that the story has a moderately satisfying ending, despite the introduction, which says that at the end of the book, Gosane still doesn't know who he is. Well, he kind of does. And I mean, there's certainly elements of what he is or who he is that he doesn't know, but I feel like I kind of figured it out, and probably he would have too. I'm not going to spoil any of that. I just kind of wanted to say it's very fast paced, very dense. Got some good dialogue. No, no like super comical slang. Nothing too bombastic. It does have some interesting concepts that I think are worth mentioning, at least. For instance, one of the things that is talked about in this book is brain development under stress, or within a given, what did I write here? Order? I guess I mean within a given structure. They discuss, there was like I'm not sure if the story is actually true, but they discussed the case of a boy who was basically raised by wolves, and because his formative years were not, he was under certain stresses, and he was not exposed to certain civilizing aspects, he later on was never able to really learn them, right? He was able to learn kind of the rudiments of language, but never really got very far in it. He was able to learn kind of the rudiments of civilization, but never got very far in it. And the book claims that the reason for this is because his formative years were spent in a specific environment. In the same way, this book takes that kind of in the opposite direction as well. What if you could like overdevelop someone's brain in kind of like a controlled environment? What would that do? And there's some interesting sci-fi aspects of that. There's a concept of attunement in this book that is kind of interesting. It's kind of a little bit of a band-aid, but the idea is that if you can take two objects and attune them to each other, then they will share a link that is basically superluminal. Or that you can attune an object to another object somewhere, and then you can make a link between them that is effectively superluminal. Kind of a neat idea, used only really a couple times in the book, but it is kind of an important aspect of the book. I mentioned before there's the idea of indistinguishable objects, or the fact that in Null-A there can't be two identical objects. But the idea in this book is that someone has engineered some very, very close to indistinguishable complex objects, which of course is a very difficult engineering problem to do. And it covers the repercussions of creating such objects in an interesting way. Another element of it that I thought was just kind of a vague philosophical thing that is never really explicitly stated, but is kind of the impression that I got, is that the Null-A never submits. There's a and the Null-A always kind of knows what to do. There's a couple of elements of the story that kind of point to this, including Gilbert Gosain's tenacity himself, but also the society that is built up in Venus, which is kind of a pseudo-voluntary kind of thing, where we don't get a lot of details for it. There's no big exposition dumps about it, but there are some little exposition dumps, and because of that, there's not a ton of detail, but enough is there to kind of get a feel for what Van Vogt is trying to get across. There are some interesting spots that have to do with this kind of philosophy, and the fact that the Null-A never submits and always kind of knows what to do. In fact, it's a big element later on when this invasion is supposedly going on. There's a couple of weaknesses in the storytelling that I thought were worth highlighting. Number one is that calling something Null-A at times feels like a bit of a grab bag, like sometimes there is something to it, but then sometimes it happens and you're like, I think he just means good. Certainly, if you picked up one of these and you looked at it, maybe someone could argue the opposite if they had a better understanding of it. But there's not enough detail about the nuances of Null-A philosophy in this to make every instance of its reference in the book make sense in the context of the philosophy. The other writing shortcut or weakness that I want to talk about are these lie detectors. It's kind of funny because sometimes you need to know if something is true, or at least the way that Van Vogt wrote the book, there are times that the characters in the book need to know if something is true, and it just so happens that there are these infallible, perfect lie detectors that can always tell a truth from a falsehood, and even provide you with a little bit of contextual information sometimes when you need it. It's a little bit of a shortcut. I found it a little bit lazy, but it's a very small element. But it does happen at some crucial points. It's a very got to kind of weigh the advantages and disadvantages of that approach. Gosain as a character has an interesting arc. He starts out thinking that he's one thing, discovers that he's not that, then discovers that he's not that either, and then discovers what he might be. I don't want to give too much detail here because I don't want to spoil it. Because this is a book that I think is actually worth reading if you like science fiction and if you like thrillers. Gosain learns a bit here and there, and what would you call it? He learns a bit here and there, and it changes his perspective on who he is, and it changes the way he reacts to things, and he has to kind of learn to get along with certain people and learn to get along with certain philosophical ideas throughout the book. That it's pretty interesting. Another strong point is that the characters have these very detailed plots, which are actually kind of fun and interesting. They're a little tricky, they're a little double-crossy, they're a little spy thrillery. They're fun, and I enjoyed that. And, despite the fact that the book has... despite the fact that the book has a lot of things in it that will later become tropes as of its writing, even knowing those tropes, there's some occasional surprises in the book, which makes it fun to read. I would say overall, it's a short, fun read. It can get a little preachy at times, and it's getting preachy for something very abstract and foreign, which lends a little bit of weirdness to its tone. Am I going to read the sequel? Probably, but I'm not salivating over it. But if you like thrillers, if you like intrigue, and if you like a little sci-fi background with some actual real, philosophical thought behind it, and a very unique set of ideas, it might be worth giving it a look. There was nothing wrong with just in a grammatical sense. Like Van Vogt did not play around with, bad grammar or anything like that. It's just well-written, normal stuff. And a pretty good read. So that is The World of Null-A by A.E. Van Vogt. Enjoyed. Lots of up points, a few minor down points, but overall, an engaging read. And not long either. So, if you decide to give it a shot, it won't take you very long to determine whether, it's for you or not. Anyway, that's what I got for today. Hope you enjoyed. Not sure what I'm doing the rest of the week, but we'll figure it out. Have a good start of your week, and I'll see you next time.